Hey everybody, welcome to Before the Commit, episode 9. This week, we'll be picking up a little bit on a topic we touched on last week, but going a little bit deeper into what is an open source model and a little controversy and, a pretty decent response from Anthropic on why and what is an open source model. Also, we have our new segment that we're introducing called the Killam chain or KILLM chain. It's a little play on words. We'll be talking about sensitive information disclosure. With me, as usual, have my friend Dustin. Dustin, how's it going?
Good.
How was your week? You're moving tomorrow?
Yeah, big move-in day tomorrow, so that's why we're doing the podcast a little bit early this week.
Nice.
So
yeah,
so I
go
did
ahead.
I know we started talking last week about open source models, and we kind of preempted that talk a little bit. I wanted to actually look into it a little bit more.
Before you get going, I think this might be a good precursor to what you're about to say.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not. But yeah, so I watched this 3-minute clip of an interview that was with Dario Modi, right? Is that how you say his name?
I think so.
Yeah. So they asked him the question about, this thing about, why don't you have open source models? And I thought his answer was actually quite brilliant. In so many ways, he said, there's a lot of language that's being thrown around right now in this world. Where is the monetization of AI? Is it at the foundational level? Is it at some higher level? Where's the value add? And he said this kind of comparison to open source code to open source models is a bit of a red herring. It's about an unfair comparison, because when you say open, you don't actually see what the models are doing when they are doing them. There's no source code for them. What you get is open weights. And really his answer to it is it a good model, right? That's really the question that people should be asking, not whether or not you provide an open source model or not. And so, yeah, I mean, there was so much more to what he said. The DeepSeek model is not an open source model. It's just, is it a good model or not? It's just a model with open weights. Is Llama a good model because it's open source? Does it make it better than, some Opus model that Anthropic put out, or, GPT-5, for example, that may not be open? So yeah, and then it kind of goes on about the industry backlash that you mentioned last week. So yeah, I thought it was just from that alone, I got a better sense of what this whole thing is about. But yeah, how did your research go?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of had a very, it's I understand what open source is pretty thoroughly when it comes to software development from, the 20 plus years you've been working in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And then when open source models came out, I kind of just went along with it in terms of saying, oh, okay, I get it. But when you dig into it, it actually is quite a bit different in the sense of, many of the points that you just made, but also others. So there seems to be kind of a variety of different stages of open source models, right? There's I'll go from the most token open source to the most full open source. You have models that are kind of open. They're saying they're open. They're giving you the weights, right? But then they have licensing around it. That means you cannot use it in various ways. A good example would be Llama is open weight. But if you look at the terms of service, there's actually limitations on if you grow too big, they can shut you down. things like that. Then there's, the open weight models without any limitations, which are what people would consider, that's where a lot of people just stop. They say, okay, that's open source. They're doing it, right? They're all open source. But the weights are really just the results of the training, right? You can't reproduce the model with the weights. It's like you've compiled it, right? So it's not in the code world. It's like they've handed you the compiled, so you can use the model, you can infer with it, but you can't recreate the model from scratch, right? Like with just the quote unquote source code. In the world of AI, the source code is the data, right? And this is where you get to kind of like the dirty little secret that a lot of people don't want to talk about. And this is where, my opinions about Anthropic and Dario might differ from yours. But in my opinion, to truly be open model, and this is just my opinion off of like 24 hours of research. So, maybe 24 hours from now, I'll be like, never mind. But I don't think you can be truly open model in the way that open source code is, unless you're also handing out the training data, right? Because unless I can actually remake your model from source, you haven't really given me the true open source auditability. And when we get into like threat vectors and vulnerabilities and stuff like that, you'll realize that the training data is actually incredibly important, because like how well you sanitize that data, what's in that data, is going to determine vulnerabilities in your model, like whether it's going to leak data later, whether it's going to go and do something dangerous. Is all a product of its training. AI is different than traditional software development, where you're not writing every line of code yourself. What you're doing is you're putting it through like it's like the Matrix, where you can do like a lifetime of judo training in the Matrix in a millisecond, and boom, you're like a judo master. Well, training is kind of like that. You hand it like
it was kung fu, by the way.
Kung fu, yeah. You give it a lifetime of kung fu training data, and then you give it a whole bunch of, you give it a data center with a whole bunch of GPUs, and you give it some time and lots of electricity, and boom, now you've got this model that's an expert at kung fu, right? But its weaknesses or its strengths in kung fu is going to be based on its training material, right? Like maybe it's trained a little bit more with this kind of kung fu master, and that kung fu master has a style that has a strength in this direction but a weakness in this direction. It's all going to be about the training materials. So the best way to explain an AI model in layman terms is kind of like, instead of coding every line of what it's going to do, like it turns this way, it looks, if it sees enemy, it aims, instead it's like you put it through a lifetime of kung fu dojos, and you told it whether it did a good job in the last run or not, and just through a lifetime of trial and error, it learned how to kick and punch and be a judo master according to your training materials, right? And therefore it is the data itself through repetition, kind of similar to how the ocean makes a stone smooth. Through repetition and through just the sheer volume of training, and it is able to dial into what you want on a line by line basis, hopefully, right?
So I don't think we disagree there. I agree with you.
So in a way you can kind of say the data is the code, right?
Right.
So at least indirectly, it's the code. It's what makes the binary at the end when you compile it. So unless you're actually giving the data out, I don't think that you've met the quote unquote criteria of like an open source model in the same vein as an open source software product.
Right.
So you might say, well, who's doing that? Well, there's Hugging Face. Hugging Face is doing that. Like you can grab a model and all of the data associated with that model and go off and run with it. You can also take open weight models that haven't given you the data, and you can fine tune them and change them. So there's ways to contribute back. So I don't know if the argument that you can't contribute back at all unless you've given all the data is completely true, but you certainly can't reproduce the model from scratch without all the data.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree. I don't disagree with you at all. I think that I'm not subscribing to. I think I think that's a good way to frame it. Like if
Mhm.
you want to compare it to like an executable, like a Linux executable or a Windows executable, then the only way
Mhm.
to reproduce it is to have the source code that you used and all of the guardrails or all of the, whatever checks needed to be added, and also all the training data to fully reproduce or recreate what's there. And so I guess, yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's sort of like depends who you talk to. This is the definition of what an open source model is, because it means a lot of different things. Even in software, like open source means a lot of different things. Like we know that certain open source things, like you can actually contribute back, and others, the source code is
Mhm.
there and you can see how it works, but they don't accept pull requests. And open source could also mean like you can use it for hobbying, but if you plan to use it commercially, like you need to buy a license for it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So, so like I said, there are models, smaller models on Hugging Face, et cetera, that are open source. Some of them are very large, actually, so I shouldn't say necessarily small. But in terms of like the size of like ChatGPT, there's nothing on Hugging Face that size. I mean, the sheer volumes of the data would be a hurdle, right? Like,
Hmm.
how are you going to give someone petabytes of data or whatever it ends up being? Um, so the argument is, well, we can't give out the data because it's too large. But the other argument is that it's too dangerous to give out the data because who knows what's in there? There's sensitive data. They might not have cleaned it all up. There might be PII in there. There might be a whole host of other things, which is kind of the argument why not having the data is a problem, right? Because you don't know what's in that model, right? One of the benefits of open source software is that you can go line by line and make sure there's no vulnerabilities in there, right? You can make sure that there isn't a nefarious training, you know what I mean? Like in there. You understand what I'm saying? Uh, like using training materials, you could hypothetically embed like a Manchurian candidate type of function in there, right? Like in other words, it's a kung fu master
Hmm.
until it encounters the exact DNA of its opponent, where all of a sudden it forgets everything and becomes completely helpless, right? That's possible with training, right? You can dial in a precise action with training. So unless you have all that training material, there's really no way of auditing it on a line by line basis the same way you can with source code, at least
Hmm.
according to
Hmm.
technology. Now, what you can do is you can go from the reverse end and test it, throw it into every single testing scenario you've ever imagined, right?
Hmm.
But as you can imagine, unless you put it against that opponent with that exact DNA, you're never going to encounter that one scenario that it's trained for. So
Hmm.
it's not enough to have complete line by line understanding of what it's doing unless you have the
Hmm.
data itself.
Right.
And even with the data, our
Right.
technology doesn't even give you the ability to understand line by line what it's going to do. So, but I'm saying you have no hope of getting there without the data. And with the data, you
Yeah.
have a hope, but the technology is not really there to get you that line by line yet anyway.
Yeah. I think part of it is like, um, you'll never be able to test every scenario, because it's like when you're testing like a web application or a desktop application or a CLI
Mhm.
application, like there's only so many paths your application can take, but you have an infinite number of sequences, especially with these. chain of thought models, like
Yeah.
or ones that are going to search out on the web combined with
They could
train.
have embedded a login and a password into the model, right? In other words, like there could be a prompt you give it where it says, "Oh, what's the password?" And then you give it an exact password that's long enough and unique enough that there's no other way that anyone could ever know what that is. Your test scenario is not going to fuzz that password in there and find this scenario,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And that unlocks it. And that
Hmm.
is where it does the thing that it's going to do only in that scenario, right? Now, I'm
Yep.
not trying to create a scare concept. I'm just saying that without being able to see the training material, you can't guarantee that something hasn't been embedded into it, a specific scenario, you know?
Hmm.
Um, so, you know, that's one thing that needs to be thought about. That's a good reason why perhaps you need to be careful about using nation state models that are coming from adversaries or people you don't trust entirely, even people you do trust, maybe.
Hmm.
Um,
Competitors.
competitors, you know, the model in a way kind of is like the binary, right? Even with the weights, it's still a binary. You
Hmm.
have very little understanding of what it's going to do in a very, very specific scenario. Um, so that's one thing to take into account. Now, there's a whole other angle to this topic where people get upset at Anthropic, which we can get into. Um, but that's the deep dark hole of open source models.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's clear as mud.
Yeah.
But like as you said, most outside of Hugging Face, most organizations that claim to have open source models are not, even DeepSeek, for example. I mean, I think you can download a version of DeepSeek off Hugging Face, and I assume the data is there, or some subset of data is there. Um,
Yeah. Well, it's challenging.
mhm.
It is very, very challenging because the other, like I said, how you hand out the data. I mean, in defense of some of these larger models, how would you hand out the data?
Yeah.
Now,
Interestingly enough, Hugging Face actually changed their storage mechanism from LFS to XET, I guess it's called, which is
I,
supposed to be a little bit more efficient in storage.
I bet you for exactly the reasons you're talking about, the data is starting
Hmm.
to get large.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, the article, like just the bluff, if you will. Um, this was from March, but it was a beta rollout. It's like becoming like the full replacement. Um, where was it? Yeah, it says hold on. Yeah, so the migration with nearly 2 million developers working over 2 million public repository, it's a real world usage. That's ultimate. That's the ultimate proving ground. Engineering a complex system like Z storage is a balancing act. You plan for scale, performance, and reliability, but once start bytes moving, challenges emerge. The trick is knowing when to move from design to theory and practice. LFS, the storage system behind the repositories today, stores large files in a separate object storage outside of the repository. LFS deduplicates at the file level. Even tiny edits create a new revision to upload and fall, painful for the multi-gigabyte files found in many hub repositories. In contrast, Z storage uses content-defined chunking, or CDC, to deduplicate at the level of bytes at approximately 64 kilobyte chunks of data. If you edit one row in a Parquet file or tweak a small piece of metadata in a GGUF model, only those changed chunks are sent over the wire. So yeah, it I think it's there's definitely a connection there.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's a world that I don't delve into too much because I'm mostly on the on the software engineering side of things and not the data engineering side of things. But there's also a whole host of challenges when it comes to that, because now that data is the source code kind of,
Mm-hmm.
there's lots of branching of data, like think of all of the crazy branching and rebasing and stuff you have to do in software development. Now you got to do that with data too.
Yeah.
So all those
Yeah, for
infrastructure
sure.
changes probably have to do with that type of stuff as well. Merge
Yeah, it's
conflicts with
really
data, all kinds of stuff.
it's a good segue into our new segment, the Killam chain. And I really think about it when I selected this as the discussion for today, but it
Mhm.
actually makes a lot of sense. Um, so yeah, this is from the OWASP top 10 for LLMs.
Mhm.
For those not familiar, OWASP is a nonprofit organization that does what's called the OWASP top 10, which is around web vulnerabilities. And they have started a few years ago this one related to LLMs. And I
Mhm.
recently became aware of it and, um, realized that a lot of this stuff is pretty well thought out already. So yeah, let's just get into it. Continuing in that same thread of like the data is the source code.
Mhm.
Um, Sensitive information can affect both the LLM and its context. This includes PII, financial details, health records. This could be, national security data for, a country, confidential business data, secrets like security credentials, legal documents, medical records was listed there. Proprietary models may also have unique training methods. I mean, even open source ones um, that are considered sensitive. LLMs, when embedded in applications, risk exposing extensive data, proprietary algorithms, or confidential details through their output. So, not only could you leak data itself, but you may not want to leak things about how it was trained or source code if you have a closed model.
Mhm.
Um, for example, like Anthropic may not want to leak how they actually are coding. Anyway, so consumers should be aware of how to interact safely with LLMs. They need to understand the risks of intentionally providing sensitive data, which may be disclosed later in the model's output. It talks about data sanitization, which you mentioned, terms of use policy, to have users opt out of their data in the training model. So I guess that's as you collect data for retraining.
Mhm.
Um, However, restrictions may not always be honored and could be bypassed via prompt injection or other methods. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to explain some of the common examples of vulnerability, which is just what we've already said. And the
Yeah.
mitigation strategies are not, you know, they are both on the sanitization of the training model and also for robust input validation. So something like light LLM or guardrails at like the model or provider level, like Bedrock or um, one of the other models that provide guardrails, would help handle harmful or sensitive data inputs to do the best to not compromise data. And I believe also light LLM could do output data sanitization. So even though the model may return bad data, you can also sanitize the output. I mean, to some degree, you could filter some of that out. It's not going to be perfect, though.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. With like an LLM proxy, you can stop things from getting into. So for instance, if the LLM was going down a certain topic that you didn't want it to talk about, or if it was gonna, you know, hallucinate in some way, there's ways that you can stop it from doing that by having qualitative checks on the tail end of a proxy. There's also, safeguards you can do for malicious things, you know, that might happen in the future with LLMs. There's some there's some threat vectors where people could hypothetically, I don't know if there's been any that have been exploited, but could hypothetically inject malicious things into training data and then exploit it on the tail end on the inference side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And then a proxy could safeguard you from that if there was a signature to that type of attack it could detect. Um, yeah, it's a pretty big, you know, and the reason why I think this is a challenging problem is because, like I said, right, it's it's like the combination of a whole bunch of conflicting things at once. You have all the major model producers not putting out their data for a variety of reasons, some of which are, just logistical,
Hmm.
and that is the source code, right? So, so uh, even when you have an open source model, if you don't have the data, you don't have the true source code, and you don't know what's in there. There could be something in there that's being leaked. Now, all of the data that has been produced by humans digitally has already been mostly consumed by these LLMs, and they're at the point where they don't have any more data. So what's become increasingly important is to own one of those sources of new data, whether it be a social media company or whether it be some form of sensors in the physical environment, or whether it be, you know, like having a like YouTube or like Reddit, YouTube, X, uh, cameras, who knows, any source of data, right? And for the companies that own that source of data, that's their competitive advantage, is to mine that data to the best of their ability. Um, and I think if they make a mistake in there and they don't sanitize that data properly, one of those things you're doing, like sending an email in Gmail or making a DM in X, or one of these other types of actions that you might consider to be private, could accidentally be leaked because perhaps it's added into the training data in this race to try to win the AI race and get all the data into your model as fast as possible. There's a mistake made. They don't sanitize the data properly. And now your internal communication is leaked out in some sort of LLM response, you know? Like, you could imagine that an executive at a major company sends a private email, and then that data is used in training material. Sometime later, someone asks a question about last quarter, and they're ex- given some sort of context about an email sent by the CEO, and that might be a way that data is leaked. So it's hard to tell how big of a problem it'll be, but I imagine it's definitely going to be a problem because everyone right now is at breakneck speeds to try to win and compete. So I think that, and the data itself is hidden behind closed doors, so it's bound to be a problem that needs to be tackled at some point in the future.
Yeah, I mean, another way this could be done. So, like, if I am an organization and I am using a model and I want to prevent from something bad coming back, of course, I can always add controls. But what if somebody was trying to uh, find out things about your model? So,
Mhm.
um, one of the methodologies that attackers use is they will go and start trying to create a clone of like your models and weights to the best of their ability. So even in a closed source model, what they'll do is they will take like pictures of like cats and dogs, for example, and
Mhm.
then look at the responses and then add noise to it and try to kind of create an offline version of it and then use it as a way to test and basically penetration test offline, um, without alerting to like what you might be trying to do to try to extrapolate, maybe things something from inside of a model, for example, that may have, say you were trying to figure out like how the anthropic models worked and you wanted to
Mhm.
like reproduce that for some reason. You could use that as a methodology to try to reverse engineer what's going on or see if you can coerce the model into leaking something out. um,
Yeah, I
or
think
there
one
could
of
be
the
Mhm.
one of the examples they gave in the article was that someone just typed the prompt poem over and over and over again or something, right?
Mm,
just a single word, the word poem, and they just typed it into the LLM over and over and over. And maybe they put it in a loop with some sort of engineering. And the end result was that after a certain amount of time of just giving it the same one word prompt over and over and over again, like the LLM just started outputting stuff in its memory,
mm-hmm,
like stuff like that's unrelated to
mm-hmm.
the topic, but it kind of rings true to my thoughts about LLMs. I found, I, after using LLMs for a very long time, I can start to sense when it's going to hallucinate. And it's usually when you ask it a question that you're expecting an answer for, right? But you ask it about a question that it has no training material about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So usually that happens when you're talking about like usually when you're talking about like things in the public realm, it doesn't happen very often. But when you're talking about something very personal, hallucinations happen more often. And the reason is that there's not a lot of data about your personal company or your personal hobby or what you're doing behind the scenes, right? So it'll try to fill in the gaps, right? So uh, if you go to the LLM and say, what did I do yesterday, right? It's not going to say, that's crazy, I couldn't tell you what you did yesterday because I wasn't there. It'll make up what you did yesterday
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
you asked it to do something and it doesn't have the ability to fail. It has to succeed at it. So it does the best it can with the time limit it has, and at some point it just says, "Well, you know what? I gotta put something down." Um, so if you find yourself asking a question that very possibly doesn't have an answer in the world for it, like it's like a novel question of some sort, then you need to be very careful about how you ask that question so that you don't give it the ability to hallucinate. So, in other words, like sometimes it helps to say, hey, if there is no answer, that's a correct answer, right? If you don't know, say you don't know, things like that. So, I think that that's you start to get a sense for when it's going to hallucinate and when it isn't going to hallucinate. So it doesn't surprise me that if you were to give it the word poem over and over and over again, that eventually it's just like, I don't know what this user is doing. I'm just going to start giving it stuff and hoping that it likes it, you know? And then that stuff could be sensitive. It could be
Yep.
internal source code. It could be system prompts. It could be who knows what.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm reading some of these methodologies for penetration testing. Um, and they're just, it's fuzzing in many cases, um, to see if you can coerce the LLM to tell you something that
Yeah.
you wouldn't normally want it to do. But it's a lot harder to defend against because, um, the definition of source code is so so much different.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that I get the sense that the defense for this is going to be defense in depth and not necessarily like, "Ooh, wow, this new model came out to solve the
Hmm.
problem."
Hmm.
It's going to be like it seems to be something deep in the training of the model. In order to make the model useful, you got to make it like optimistic, like it's going to try to solve the problem. But that also gives it a weakness where it tries to solve the problem when it can't solve the problem, you know? So you
Hmm.
kind of have to have like it's kind of like you need systems of you need an AI that's answering the problem and an AI that's got a different prompt that's only there to stop hallucinations or only there to keep the other LLM straight. And that's when you see products that have guarded against hallucinations. That's the methodology they're using. They're using a circular critique type of methodology where the first LLM tries to solve the problem. The second LLM is critiquing the first LLM and keeping it honest and on topic and with citations of real data.
It's funny. There was an article in BBC. I think it came out today. Yeah, and people are starting to use AI to plan vacations. And so anyway, somebody paid $160 to go to a fictional place in Peru, the Sacred Canyon of Humanity. And so basically, like, it combined two places that have no relation. It created like fictitious images. Yeah.
Like
Yeah, so
a new
there's
type.
sites like Wonderplan and Layla that help people use generative AI to help people organize their trips. While these programs can offer valuable travel tips, when they're not working properly, they can also lead people into some frustrating or even dangerous situations when they're not.
Yeah.
This is a lesson some travelers are learning when they arrive at their would-be destination, only to find they've been fed incorrect information. We're steered to a place that only exists in the hardwired imagination of a robot.
That's funny. That's funny.
Uh,
But it's crazy. Imagine, like, those websites, when you type in something into Google and it doesn't find a result, you end up on a website that's trying to dynamically make it sound like they have a page about that.
yeah, exactly.
Well, like with AI, they could make a product page for a product that doesn't exist based on some sort of weird thing you typed in. Like, I'm looking for a cat toy with an elephant hat, and then it produces a cat toy with an elephant hat that doesn't exist in reality, and you go buy it, right? Like, you could make the equivalent of like dynamic uh fake product listings with generative AI.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen like things like people generating like fall photos and
Hmm.
then selling them for $2 on Etsy and like making thousands of dollars from that. Like,
There's
yeah.
definitely a lot of arbitrage going on in that moment where not everyone has figured out that it's very easy to generate certain things, where you could probably make a lot of money on Fiverr.
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
getting the last gasps of that market before everyone realizes they can just generate their Christmas cards in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
So,
Oh, I have one
pivoting.
thing I wanted to bring up, right?
Oh yeah.
As we were talking about open source. So
Hmm.
this is kind of like a weird bespoke topic, but in a world where, like, in traditional open source software, the idea of contributing back, right, is like you're going to write lines of code and make a pull request, and you're going to, meet the standards that they have, and they're going to accept your pull request, and your code is integrated, and now you are a contributor and you've helped that open source project by contributing. And the argument is that with open source models, you can't do that, right? Now in Hugging Face, I know you can. The data's there. You could branch off. You can fine tune even the ones that don't have the data there. You can contribute by putting derivative models off of ones that make incremental improvements, etc. Uh, but I was thinking, like, well, how much of my data is already in these models? Haven't I already contributed? You know,
I mean, if it's trained on
if I
Reddit
wrote a banger
data.
of a post for how to do something in engineering, and that ended up into I went into like
Hmm.
Grok, and I was just like crunching numbers. I was like, what's the percentage chance? Now, obviously, it doesn't have the variables, so this is just like complete speculation. But
Hmm.
what's the probability that one of my pieces of data on the web ended up inside of ChatGPT, let's say? And obviously, all these numbers are crap because we don't know what's going on inside of ChatGPT. But I'd say it's probably about as good as anything. It talks about the fact that it knows how much petabytes of data they have. It knows how much of cleanup they've done and how many tokens they have that they train on. Some of the public information, and it basically came to a rough estimate of, like, on average, the idea that one of your pieces of content ended up in ChatGPT is probably 1 out of 100,000. But if you wrote something that went semi-viral, it's probably 1 in 100. You know, so maybe even more, maybe even more probable than that. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's a lot of people who have already technically contributed to this in some way or another. Is
Yeah,
that an argument that's valid?
I think so. I mean, it says that you live in Rego Park, so I mean, I guess it's somewhat accurate.
I mean, that's not true, but
It says you,
I
yeah.
did at some point contribute
I
that
I
data.
mean, it says you live there, so I mean, it was definitely trained on something. Um,
Yeah.
so I think it's hard to know exactly because I think it's better to test with an offline model. It's harder today to determine that with sort of like the real time augmentation of the chain of thought, like the search on the web, and then
Yeah, yours could have probably just done a web search
that.
and found out that Rego Park thing, or something like
Yeah,
that.
so I think yeah, for sure. I mean, this was a discussion that we had a few podcasts ago about how you
Yeah.
could coerce the results about how there might be a shift in internet marketing, right? From, Google AdWords to coercing a model that's trained by, for example, like going into Reddit and like positioning yourself as a thought leader or a podcast where you talk about certain things, and then that data gets scraped, and then when somebody starts searching for mod secops, like for example,
Mhm.
I looked up myself and it said Gershman is a pioneer in DevSecOps evolving toward mod secops. I mean, that's a term that we created, and it already says that it knows about mod secops. So if I say, what is mod, who invented mod secops,
Yeah,
it'll
I mean,
probably.
a good example is if I go on Grok and I ask it questions about this podcast, it knows about what we've talked about in our episodes. So there, I guess my point I'm trying to make is that without the data being public, and by the way, I'm not trying to go on a campaign to make the data public. I don't think that's going to happen. Um, but the point I'm trying to make is that if you're going to go out there and make a statement like Dario did about how nobody contributes, it's a little
I think
bit
it's
self-serving to say
it's
that when you're holding all this data that you're not making public that is from the people that you're saying haven't contribute, and you've already been sued on it and lost in some cases, or at least had to settle. So it's like, is that count as a contribution? I personally don't. I believe that if I go to a art gallery and I look at some art and that inspires me to go make some art, that I didn't
mhm,
steal anything. And I
yeah.
believe that with AI as well. But if you're going to go out there and make a statement about how nobody contributed to you,
Hmm.
then did nobody contribute really? Or, you know, like if Anthropic had to make all their data public, would they be sued more or less? I think they'd probably be sued more because other people would realize how much of the data is from other sources that are not public. I don't know. I'm just speculating. But my
Yeah,
point
I
is
mean,
that it's a and there's an argument to be made that, I mean, if you look at the press releases that Anthropic puts out, I mean, they have a press release about one of their engineers being blackmailed by their own model. They have a press release about how ChatGPT was more likely to or certain models were more likely to use nukes in a nuclear war or not. I mean, they were all like really weird. Like if you look into the engineering behind it, it's all silliness. And and um, it's clear that they have kind of like a little bit of a regulatory strategy where they rightfully or wrongfully bring up in the public about how scary AI is.
mhm.
They make themselves out to be kind of like the the responsible one in AI, and they say, well, doing a open source model is irresponsible because people would use that to create things that were bad. And it just comes off a little bit self-serving because of course they want to close the door behind them because they're you know one of the players that are at the top, and it's they know that at some point the you want to have every advantage you can get, and regulatory capture is one of those advantages. If you can get like they had one of the things that they had gotten some flack for was they were pushing for a bill in California that would have forced all AI model producers to have a kill switch in there so that the government could shut them off. And one of the biggest critics of that was the open source models. We were like, you're putting all these burdens on us that we've got to do this by law now. We're not funded. So, it's one of those tactics that you scare the government into creating laws that make it hard for the smaller players to follow behind the bigger players. It's called regulatory capture. And it seems to be a strategy. I'm obviously, this is my own opinion, but others have put it out there, including some in some high places. I think David Sachs had mentioned it, or someone else in the All In podcast, about the regulatory capture angle. So it's something that's out there that people are kind of speculating or arguing about on the web. So some people say, well, it's kind of self-serving that they don't have an open source model, and they're also out there trying to create legislation that stops open source models, and they're trying to scare the government into making it so that there's laws that stop other open source models. So, depends on where you shake out on all that.
I suspect that I'm not a lawyer, so I can only say what the law says in terms of in the United States. Like there are copyright laws and rules around derivative works. And so, we've talked here many times about, if you use creative works to train your model, and then, you can then prove that, this, multimodal creation looks like it was created from something that you own the copyright to, you may have a defensible suit on your hands. But I don't think that, I think for things like music, it's really clear. Like, in the 90s, there was a whole thing about sampling, and for many years, record companies did nothing. They saw it as a way to kind of build a following. And then, when it got out of hand and people were profiting off of, the sampled version of the song made more money than the original, that's when record companies stepped in and started, wanting to recoup costs and controlling the market and things like that nature, and like crack down on sampling. And so I suspect there's a day of reckoning where there will be lots of money and payouts and more rules around training and how training is monitored. And whether or not you have an open source model or not, I think is less important. And somebody will find a way to prove that you trained my data. My weblogs prove it. I see you scraped all my data, and I want a piece of that. And we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
I think it's only a matter of time till there is there's going to be a payday, some recouping of costs for, anybody that has any kind of creative works, maybe a class action lawsuit or something of that nature against organizations. If there isn't already, I'm not kind of paying attention to lawsuits and things of that nature, but I suspect there will be something at some point. And there will have to probably be a clarification on copyright laws as it relates to creative works, whether it be art or music or movies, permission to use a likeness. I mean, there's not a lot of laws around using people's faces for, for example, like you could take someone's face and throw it in Grok and animate it. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that, just that you have to have permission. And so, there's not a lot of regulation, even in the United States, around what is acceptable use. So, I mean, I don't think Anthropic is the bad person here. I think there's a lot of, I don't say bad or good. I don't want to be moral here, but I think there's a lot of things going on that are kind of flying under the radar right now.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily prescribing like good or bad to Anthropic in this. It's just that
Yeah.
I'm prescribing, or I'm speculating that perhaps their idealism on this is not completely idealistic. It's also pragmatic to some extent, um, is what I'm really saying.
Mm.
Uh, I think it's in their best interest to do what they're doing based on their current lane in the market. But yeah, it's an interesting topic. That's where people kind of blew up about it, was because Dario gets a lot of pressure from folks saying, "Why don't you have an open source model?" And his responses to that are around what we've discussed, and that sometimes causes controversy. But there is some truth to the fact that you cannot contribute in the same ways to a open source AI model as you can with an open source software project. You also can't audit it the same way, you know?
Yeah. Somebody said they should release Claudio that talks about it liking espresso. Because like there's Gemma, which is Gemini, and Mixtral, which is Mistral, and so yeah, instead of Claudio.
Claudio.
So we didn't really talk much about coding today. I wanted to throw one curveball out there. So this is a news out of Atlassian, which are the makers of Jira and Confluence. And
Mm-hmm.
Atlassian launched an AI product called Jira Product Discovery Agents. This new feature, now in beta, allows project managers to write a high-level user story or feature brief in natural language. The AI agent takes over, performing several autonomous tests. It breaks it up down into granular engineering tasks, subtasks, and epics, creates mock-ups of the UI UX, generates a draft of the required code in a new branch, and even writes the initial documentation and test stubs. The goal is to
Mm-hmm.
automate the entire sprint zero and initial boilerplate, allowing human developers to start directly with functional, albeit basic code base. This shifts the AI intervention point from up the stack from the developer's ID to the project manager's backlog. It's a direct shot across the bow of the traditional agile process. If AI can translate a business requirement directly into a working code branch, it blurs the line between PMs, designers, and engineers. It suggests a future where the initial, often tedious translation of idea to task to code is fully automated. The role of the development team then becomes one of refinement, integration, and handling complex edge cases. More finishers than starters.
Yeah. I mean, this is right in line with where, I think we all see it going, which is
Mm-hmm.
that it's weird that software engineering has been very much like, it's you like to think of it as super advanced because you work in a high tech, but
Mm-hmm.
software engineering has been very individual contributor based. Like it's like farm,
Mm.
it's like gardening. It's in the gardening stage, right? It's like, oh wow, Jeff's got a green thumb. His tomatoes are great, you know, and that's how engineering has been. It's crazy to
Yeah.
think about it, but it's been that way. And now we're going to like John Deere AI freaking,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
like
Mass
like your G
harvesting.
like mass industrial harvesting, and
Yeah.
and what you're seeing is the buildup of all of the tools around that are going to be necessary in order to make that possible without you know without mass chaos, right? um and not to imply that mass chaos will happen. I'm saying that these are the things you have to put in place in order to make sure that all this stuff goes, you know just like you know just like you have to set up all the GPS infrastructure, and your fields have to be designed a certain way, and you got to do all the pre-configuration, and then you can do your self-driving plows. um, well, it's going to be similar to this. There's a whole bunch of infrastructure work that has to be done. There's a whole bunch of like tools that have been unsophisticated because they've been operated by hand by human operators, but now have to become very sophisticated because they're going to be operated by automation. And some of those things are going to disappear entirely, and we don't know it yet. We think it still exists because we're used to using that tool, but it's going to disappear as we realize it's unnecessary, or it's going to change shape in some way. And so the world of Jira, GitLab, GitHub, all those sort of DevSecOps vendor-ish tools is going to be in complete disruption, and they're all trying to figure out where they fit in.
Yeah.
GitLab has something similar where they're doing issue creation and stuff like that. What I will say is that GitLab has the code in context when you write an issue, so that's helpful. Jira, I'm not sure if it's going to have the code in context. It's just going to have its litany of Jira documents, which in my experience have never been very good at any organization I've ever worked for. So I have a hard time believing that Jira is going to be able to write great tickets without having the code in context. Now, maybe it has some element of getting the code in context or some way of figuring that out.
Well, they have Bitbucket, which is their coding tool,
That's
and
true.
you can
Maybe they're gonna
integrate
okay.
it with other systems. Like there's a Jira too. I mean, I think in general the idea is that like I don't think there's a winner here in terms of like who has the best platform. I think the winner is using it, is knowing how to integrate the tools into your SDLC. I think the misnomer around all SDLCs are the same. Like if anything that Agile taught us is like there's no way to do, like the Agile Manifesto was never written as a doctrine. It was just like you do this over that. So anybody that said they were doing Agile wasn't actually doing it, because a core tenet of Agile was to not claim us, not to plant your flag somewhere, because you need to focus on continuous improvement, and it needs to be tailored to your use case. It just had ideals that you strive for. So I think as long
you
as
always have another retro, so you're never done.
Exactly. So so an analogy is, one analogy is, if you remember, like 10 years ago, like Docker came out, and like before that you would have to like write documentation to sysadmin, and you didn't have sudo rights, and then you'd have to like tell them all the dependencies you needed to install, and I need a database, and that's not the right version of the database. And then Docker came along, and of course Kubernetes, later, that basically, like I wouldn't say sysadmins disappeared, but the friction between an engineer being able to deploy, because you could just tell the sysadmin, I need Docker, and here's my container, and I might need network connectivity outbound, if there's a firewall or ingress.
Well, the reason why Docker and all that was so much of a paradigm shift is it encapsulated the platform. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like so much of software engineering was a struggle up until that point, because the platforms were constantly in shift. There was no base platform that was identical. Like,
I guess what I'm saying is not the technology itself and how it encapsulated it. What I'm saying is that it empowered the engineer to do something that they could never do before. So the reason I mentioned that is like, it's not the same paradigm shift, but in the fact that it allows a PM to, because up until that point, unless you were a technical PM, you couldn't go and start any of this process. You would have to wait for an engineer to come in.
It's the same as that paradigm shift in a way, where it empowers others to get involved in things that they normally wouldn't have been involved in before. It allows you to do. I think that it allows engineers to take a step up into a more forest view of the code versus getting into the weeds. But I think it also allows non-technical folks to take a step down deeper into the technical aspects of the product in the same way. I don't think of it that way often because I'm coming at it from the perspective of technical, but I can imagine, it's hard for me to imagine because I'd have to erase my entire life and be non-technical, but I can imagine that it's been just as empowering from that angle to come at it from like, oh wow, look at all this stuff that I could understand about what's going on that I never could understand before. All the questions I would love to have asked an engineer and them to respond to me in a language that I understand, as opposed to talking to a socially awkward person who's going to rattle off a bunch of acronyms.
Right, right, right. So the other analogy was like, the PM doesn't become a Michelin star chef, like they don't automatically know how to do it. But like a meal prep
Yeah.
kit service, you don't have to go food shopping. You don't have to have a recipe. You just have to follow the instructions. So you can go and get a meal prep kit and you can make a meal. Like it's not going to be like a Michelin star chef would, but you can make a really good meal. And that's kind of like what you are allowing a PM to do, is to start the meal. And then of course the engineer would come in and they maybe check out the code or they make the refinements. And
And
over
all of that has synergistic benefits that are outside of just like, if you can't fall into the 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 trap of thinking of it as like a zero sum game, in the sense that like, oh yeah, the product managers know more about code, but they're never going to be as good at coding as the engineers. And the engineers
right.
know a little bit more about product, but they're never going to be good at writing technical articles. No, it's not about like the product managers writing code or the engineers writing technical articles. It's that if they can each understand a little bit more of each other's world, then it
Mm,
solves one of the human problems with how software has been developed all this time,
mhm.
which is that no matter how sophisticated your software company is, there's always this dichotomy between engineers and the
It's
product
a little
people.
bit, it's almost like an air gap, like, in certain
Yeah.
networks where you cross an air gap, like there's I don't know what it looks like over there. And like, oh, it's like,
It's like two alien races talking to each other,
yeah, yeah.
and
And
they
so
all
like,
there's no
and
perfect
yeah,
translation, you know?
yeah. The other thing I was thinking is like sometimes the PM might be translating a requirement into something they think is an engineering, you know, they they don't have the ability to see what their idea looks like in terms of engineering. So you give the PM the ability to experiment with what the specification is. So before they actually write a ticket, they can actually run their thought process through the paces, or perhaps even hand off, like before giving it to an engineer and slotting it into a sprint. They can actually
Yeah.
demo their kind of wireframe in real. Like, we do some stuff with our website, where we actually can A/B test some of this stuff. And you could see how a PM could actually go in there, start suggesting changes, and then before it's even handed off to engineering, you could have three different versions of that and hand it back to the customer that maybe took minutes, versus forcing yourself to spend engineering time to go down a path that ultimately, like, is not. I mean, this is really how you unlock the part of agile that, most organizations never get to because of resource constraints and, having to prioritize and things of that nature. You really kind of open the gate in terms of what is possible.
Yeah. I think a lot of loss of time in software engineering is the back and forth between
Mm,
those two different boundaries, right? Like the weird like dichotomy between tech folks and non-tech folks, right? The more that you have to go back and forth between that boundary in order to get a task done, the the longer the project's going to take, right? If the person who's non-technical writes a ticket that doesn't understand the logical like forks in the road that they have to go down in order to fully spec out that ticket, then the engineer has to come back and be like, well, what about this scenario? What about that scenario? What do you want to happen here? What do you want to happen there? And then that person has to start thinking about it. I'll get back to you, and then, what does an engineer do when they get that? They move on to another ticket. And then it
yeah,
doesn't mean that when that person gets back to them, they immediately shift gears back. They might take a day or two to work on that other ticket now. They're like, too bad you missed your shot. you
right,
know,
right.
I'll get to you when I am looking for another ticket again, you know? Um, so much of that, like, hurry up and then wait and then hurry up again is what slows down software projects, right? Um, and if the product manager who had this interesting idea for a feature would write a ticket, and then that the AI agent would study the code base and come back to them and be like, well, what about this scenario? Right?
Yeah.
You have just shaved days off the development process with that alone, right? That's it. If you just get the engineers a ticket that doesn't have any derivative questions out of it, you have eliminated probably 80% of the waste in software development.
Yeah, it really just it reminds me of like how quantum computers actually work, where they are able to go down multiple paths at the same time and see what the end result might be. So like the concept of like I create a branch and then I have branches of branches that are doing different things, and I can do almost like simulation of like, you see this sometimes with LLMs. Sometimes it will show you two different versions of a response and then ask you which one you like better, whether it be an image or, you know, a textual response. But yeah, I can really see how, like, you know, why would you just not want one version of what that prompt might do? You might want to see three different versions of that same thing. I think Grok does this with some of its image generation, where it'll give you four different versions of the same animation, and then you can pick and refine. So yeah, I really think that there's, you know, there's some little bit of, you know, sometimes the LLM will do something in a way one time, and then you could have the same exact prompts run again in another branch and you'll get a slightly different result.
Yeah, it's not
deterministic.
Once you're in the AI world, you're so far away from deterministic.
Yeah, but
it's
like maybe there's
that's the real paradigm shift of in
Mhm.
software engineering, going from traditional software to AI development. Is it the biggest paradigm shift out of it all is the idea of you're in the probabilistic world and not the deterministic world anymore.
Yeah, I think, like, you know, when we talk about security of AI and, you know, adding guardrails and things of that nature, I mean, what we're trying to do is make things more deterministic to some extent, more predictable, and prevent bad things from happening as a result of the lack of being not deterministic. So
we want to have our cake and eat it too. We want determinism when it's important, and we want probabilistic when we want options and brainstorming and novel ideas.
Yeah, I think, you know, when I think about what is possible, I think that somewhere in the middle there's a happy medium between, I'd like to see what the different variations of this are. You know, like, what would my life look like if I took a left or a right? So, you know, would my life look different? If I can see that in advance, you know, maybe present that to the PM, and they can make a decision about where should I go from here? And if I went down this road and then did that, what would have happened? And you can create something really unique that you really can't do today with traditional engineering without having an unlimited budget and a limited time.
Exactly.
Well, thanks everybody for joining. We may do this next week. We may skip a week, not sure yet. But thanks again for joining.